Good morning, Moray Rabotai. We are continuing on Masechet Avodah Zarah, and we are on top of the Chaf Bet Amud Aleph, the last piece of the first parak of Masechet Avodah Zarah. Today's Amud is being learned. L'schud Yehoshua ben Diana, Yael bat Rivka, Menashe ben Asi. Today's Amud is also being learned. Leirui Nishmat Tzipora bat Yitzchak, and Menashe ben Yaakov, Sadaf Simcha bat Faribati Ila Eden, Avraham ben Esther, and Farzaneh Diana bat Victoria, that the Neshamot should have an Aliyah. Amen. So this is going to be a very fascinating Gemara about partnership of a Jew and an Oved Kochavim when it comes to working on Shabbat. In other words, we started dealing with the coexistence of an Oved Kochavim and a Jew. When you have a property, you want to rent it to them, you want to sell it to them. Is it in Eretz Yisrael? Is it in Syria? Is it in Chutz La'aretz? Can you do it or not? And now, the last piece that we discussed was that on Shabbat, you can't necessarily rent, even in Chutz La'aretz, you can't rent your bath house to a goy, to Avodah Zarah, because people know it as your property. It's known as your bathhouse. And a person that sees that people are warming water on Shabbat there says, hey, the Jew has told the goy to work for him on Shabbat. And that's a problem, right? We mentioned that in the field perhaps is a little different because Arisa, Arisute, because the way it will work would be a self-motivated, because the Aris is a person that takes percentage out of the produce of the year. So therefore, when he's working on Shabbat, he is working adata de nafshe, he's working for himself, and therefore is allowed. And the last shita of Rav Shmuel bar Elazar said in the Gemara would be that a kuti and a goy are different, because the goy listens to you, a kuti doesn't listen to you. That's the last piece of the Gemara that we studied together. Now, we basically said that you could hire a goy to work for you, and even though that he works on Shabbat, it's fine, because arisa arisute kavit. It's adata de nafshe kavit. He's doing it for himself. We discussed a lot of the practical laws of a goy doing work for a yid on Shabbat, when the person is doing it for the majority non-Jews or for himself included, even if the majority is Jewish, in regards to the halachot of hana'ami ma'aseh akum. Not amirala akum, not telling a goy to do an isur, but rather benefiting, drawing benefit from the work that was done for a Jew on Shabbat, even without his involvement. That we discussed. Now, how about partnerships? Imagine if the Jew and the goy own a business together. Can the business be open on Shabbat? And the Jew says, well, you work on Shabbat and I go to shul, and I work on Sunday and you go to church, right? Is that mutar or is that not mutar, right? So that's really the logical partnership that you would make. Say, look, we still do half and half, 50-50 of the profits, but the way it will work is 5 days a week we will work together. One day you would work for me and you, and one day I would work for you and me. Mutar or asur? What do you say? Well, you would say, what's the problem, right? The problem is the following. If the goy is working for me on Shabbat, then it's 50-50, right? So I'm working for the 50% of him on Sunday, and he is working for my 50% on Shabbat. And that's a problem. That is a problem, because I am benefiting from my job that's being done for me by him on Shabbat. Whereas, if I tell him in the beginning, we're buying a business together, right? We're buying a BP, what they call it in East Coast, or a gas station, right? buying a gas station. Gas stations have to be, okay, you can't put a sign on Shabbat, come tomorrow, just park your car that's out of gas right now and come back tomorrow. You can't do that. It has to work the whole time, right? You have a 7-Eleven. Many Jews own these types of franchise stores that they have rules and regulations. You can't say, well, my 7-Eleven is closed on Shabbat, right? So you can't do that. So it has to be open. So how do you do it? So if you buy it together with a goy, and this does not mean that you have some Jose that is your janitor wiping the floors at 2 a.m. and you go and you give him to sign something that he doesn't even know how to read, and thereby he's your partner. That's okay. You have to speak to your Moreh Orah if he would be willing to do such a harama, such a loophole like that. But some do, some don't. Rav Heinemann doesn't do it. Others, feel uncomfortable. Some feel comfortable. But we're talking about the real partners, right? You're buying the gas station together. So you tell them, look, you work on Shabbat, I work on Sunday. You take all the Shabbat profits, I take all the Sunday profits. Chazak u'baruch. Would that be mutar? Because this means that we were never partners on Shabbat, and we were never partners on Sunday. Meikara, to begin with, I told you that I'm not going to be having any helik in Shabbat. So when you work on Shabbat, you're working 100% for yourself. And if it turns to be that one year there is more Shabbats open than Sundays, or whatever, however it is, then you get more. If you really want to sit down and do the dollars and cents, whatever you get on Shabbat is 100% yours. And whatever I get on Sunday is 100% mine. Right? So then, he could do Sunday, I could do, even though that I'm working on Sunday only because he's working on Shabbat, even though that the mindset is the same, but we were never partners. Whereas if we started the business, we started together, we bought it together, it's a 50-50 together, and then when at the end of the year we want to divide the dividends and the income, we're like scratching our heads and say, oh, wait a second, what's going to happen with Shabbat? You take Sundays, they can't do that. Because that already, you're taking 50% of the Shabbat profits, which you're not allowed to do when you are partner in the work done on Shabbat. So that's how we usually, generally speaking, view this, and that's the Gemara that we're going to go through today to understand what happened. We're going to say it in a story in the Gemara, and perhaps, if time allows, a story in the time of Rabbeinu Tam, in time of the Rishonim, as well, to understand this case a little better. So says the Gemara.
Is that similar to like Coffee Bean, what they did? It's like they had all the Saturdays and Sundays.
I don't want to discuss the cases of current history. So says the Gemara. This is on the line that starts with Mipenei. It's 8 lines down from the top of the Amud. Hana'u morikai de oved kochavim nakat b'shabata ve'Yisrael bechad b'shabata. There was a case of 2 people who owned a land, and one of them was a Jew, one of them was a Goy, and they would work together, right? They would work together and plant and harvest and all the things that the field of of Zafran needs, so to speak, and that was their business. So they came, when they wanted to divide their profits, they came to Rava, right? Aturekamed Rava and Sharanehu. Rava said, Chazak u'baruch, you could do it. You work on Shabbat, the Jew works on Sunday or whatever day of the week, and that is mutar. You could do it, no problem. So when Ravina heard this story, that Rava said it's mutar, he said, wait a second. You missed a braita. Says the Gemara, Iteve Ravina l'Rava, Yisrael ve'oved kochavim, shekiblu sadeh b'shutafut. If a Jew and a non-Jew accepted a sadeh field together to work, lo yamar Yisrael le'oved kochavim tol chelkecha b'Shabbat ve'ani bechol. You take your part on Shabbat, right? You, the goy, you take the part of Shabbat profits, and I take the part of the Sunday or any other weekday profit that I work. Ve'ani bechol. If they did that, that's asur. You can't do that, because then, again, the Jew is benefiting from the 50% partnership of Shabbat, and that you cannot do because you're working on Shabbat. The goy is working for you on Shabbat. But from the beginning, when they're getting this business, if they made the Tanai, if they agreed upon this partnership in a structure of I work and you work 5 days a week, I work one day, I have nothing to do with Shabbat, you work Shabbat, and I have nothing to do with it, right? Mutar. Then it's mutar. So, but if they didn't make this condition from the beginning when they became partners, and now they come to the Heshbon at the end of the year, comes April 15th, and they're like, oh, wait a second, what do we do? How do we do this? Let's do half and half. You worked on Shabbat, I worked on Sunday, Hazakubaru. If they did this, Asur. That will be Asur. So it seems like the case of Rava, that this Yid and the Goy came to him, is the last part of this Braita that says, Ve'imba'u le'eshbon Asur. If they come and ask you after they already have set up the partnership, then it's Asur. So how in the world did Rava paskin for this couple, for these partners, that came to him, that it's mutar their case? Again, Rava was approached by this partnership, and they had this deal that he worked on Shabbat, he worked on Sunday, and Rava said, it's mutar. The Braita seems to say, in Ba'u le'heshbon, if they did not make the Tanai, the condition from the beginning, and now they come to ask you, that would be Asur. Says the Gemara, Ichsif. This is, again, remember, this is Ravina asking a question to Rava. And the Gemara says Rava was Ichsif, he was embarrassed. He's like, this is like no questions asked. You have a Braita that's black and white against an Amorah, there's nothing to say, right? Because Amoraim cannot disagree with a Braita. Braita is, now the general rule is, all of the Amoraim, the Gemara, Chachmei Gemara, they are expected to know all the Mishnayot. That's Pashut. They're expected to know the body of Tanaic work that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi put together, right? But the Braita, not everybody knew. Now, Braita usually is the name, like the Rambam writes in Pirush Mishnayot, the Haktabat Pirush Mishnayot, he writes that Braita was the name of the book that Rebbe's counterpart, so to speak, authored, Rabbi Chia, right, who was a Talmid Muvhak, a Talmid Chaver of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, and he wrote a sefer called it Mishnah. He wrote a sefer called it Braita, right? But Braita became the generic name for the other Tanaic works aside from the work of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. You find it called Braita that is from Rav Chia and Ravash, that is considered a legitimate Braita. Not every Amorah knew every Braita. But at the same time, a legitimate Braita is a Tanaic work, and an Amorah cannot disagree with a Tana. It's at different levels, right? And therefore, and this is a whole discussion, the Shulchan Aruch and the Nosei Kelim of the Shulchan Aruch discussed this in Choshen Mishpat, in Siman Chafhei, whether or not an Acharon can disagree with a Rishon, right? One of the Acharonim, one of the more recent halachic authorities could disagree with one of the medievals, right? Can they do that? You find in some unique cases that people like the Vilna Gaon, like the Pri Hadash, like the Shagadaryeh, they do disagree with the Rishonim, but generally speaking, one of the Aharonim does not disagree with one of the Rishonim. But certainly one of the Amoraim cannot disagree with one of the Tanaim. So when you have a discussion in the Gemara between two Amoraim, and then one of them pulls out a Braita, and you can't find another Braita that disagrees with that. It's not like Machloket Tanaim. It's black and white in Braita. The Gemara says, oh, Itanya, Tanya. If it's a Braita, you surrender, basically, right? So here is basically a similar case. He pulled out the Braita. So basically, how can you paskin that's mutar? I show you a Braita that says black and white, that if they did not make the condition to begin with, it would be asur, against your psak. And the Gemara says, Rav was ichsif, he was embarrassed. There's nothing to answer to that, right? He was wrong, basically, in his psak. Now, not too quick. We'll see a different version of this story in just a moment. Lesof, iglai milta, at the end, turned out to be that was not the case. Even though that Rava did not inquire about the details of the partnership, because they came to him at the end when they wanted to divide the profits. But turned out to be that when this Goy and this Yid started their partnership, it was exactly like this. In other words, they took this business together, this field together, and they said, well, I can't work on Shabbat, the Jew said. So no problem, he said. I work on Sunday, and I have nothing to do with Shabbat. You work on Shabbat, and you have nothing to do with Sundays or whatever other weekday that I'm going to work alone. And that was, Taka, in the beginning, the understanding of the partnership. So therefore, even according to the Braita that Ravina brought to Rava, that would be the psak still. Even though that Rava did not inquire and didn't know, but nevertheless, the psak that he gave was correct. Right? Sometimes you need siyata d'shmaya. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it says, Bekerev Elokim Ishpot. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is nitzav be'adat kel. Hashem is with the dayanim, and Shechina is shora with the chachamim. Sometimes you need siyata d'shmaya to paskin properly, even those things that you didn't know. There is a very interesting brisker Rav about a Shulchan Aruch that was accepted, psak of Shulchan Aruch was accepted. So, and Rambam, same thing, that even those things that Shulchan Aruch may not have thought, or Rambam may not have thought, when they wrote the Shulchan Aruch or the Rambam, they would become a part of the body of the halacha, because there's a siyata d'shmaya that the Shulchan Aruch had, Rambam had, for that body of work to become part of the Jewish literature and code of Jewish law, and therefore it's binding even in that way. It was like a lot to talk about that in a different time, but nevertheless, here you see as a siyata d'shmaya, Ravina asked the question, and Rava was actually correct when you determined the halachic psak at the end of the day, even though that he didn't understand the reason, but this psak was correct. So says the Gemara, the hitnu meikara havu. This case was a partnership with the Tanai, with the understanding and the condition to begin with. Now, Rav Gvia mibekatil amar hanau shetili dor lava. He said, no, the case was completely different. They were not discussing a work on Shabbat. You know what the partnership was? Partnership was very simple. There was a field of trees that were newly planted, right? A fresh field. They were hired to deal with this land, but there's one problem. Problem is, the first 3 years when the fruits produce, what is it called? Orla. Can you eat fruits of Orla? Absolutely not. So how's the Jew and the Goy do their partnership when you have such a problem? So what they did was, the Jew and the non-Jew said, wait a second. You work the first 3 years, we work together, right? You get the first 3 years, and I get the second 3 years, right? Fair enough.
No, it's not fair.
So it's not fair because he's saying it's more produce, right? Well, let's imagine that it was fair, right? Imagine if the amount of fruits were the same, right? Or it's a 3.5 years, whatever it is, right? But you want to do a havla'ah in the first 3 years. This way, the Jew is not having to deal with the produce of orla. Is working the land. The partnership is working the land, and he has no part in it. And the goy would not have any part in the next subsequent years, right? So says the Gemara, Oved kochavim achir shnei deorla. Oved kochavim would take the fruits, the produce of the first 3 years of orla. VeYisrael shani de'etera. The Jew would take the years that are mutar. Now 2 years, whatever it is that they did a chashbon, that would be fair, right? So says the Gemara, Atul kabed Rava. This was the case that came to Rava. They asked this question to Rava, Sharaleu, and Rava said it's mutar, mutarim lachem, mutarim lachem, mutarim lachem. Why is that? Because is it asur for a yid to work on a field that's orla? No. Go work on a field that's orla. You can't eat it. But you can work it. It's not like working on Shabbat that's asur. Working on an orla field is fine. So I could have worked myself even, if I wanted to. I could work and I'm not just going to eat the fruits, right? So the fact that the partnership worked on the thing, I worked on there's no problem with that. So you could say, even at the end, you could say, well, you take the first 3 years, I take the next 2. No, there's no problem with that whatsoever, because there's no issue of working on an orla field for a Jew. So says the Gemara, wait a second, if that's the psak, that was the case, something is missing here. Because you told me the structure of the story was such that Ravina asked a question to Rava from a Braita and he was embarrassed. So what kind of business does that Braita have to do with Orla? The Braita that Ravina brought to Rava's attention was a partnership on Shabbat. That if they made up from the beginning is mutar, if they didn't make up from the beginning is asur, if they came at the end is asur. What's the point of saying that Braita to Rava? So says the Gemara, no problem. He was not asking a question. He was supporting Rava's psak. Ravina was helping him in his psak. Veha otve Ravina le Rava. The Gemara says no. Le siyue. He was helping him. In other words, how's he helping him? By the way, he's helping him that you see that if their partnership is in such way that the Jew does not have an isur of working, right? For instance, in the beginning, if they made up in the beginning for a Shabbat case, right? If they made up in the beginning that you have the Shabbat, I have the weekday, one of the weekdays, that's mutar, we said, right? Because the goy is not doing anything that's asur for me, right? In this case, is the same thing. That happens to be a proof, a support for Rava, because in this case, had the Jew wanted to do the work himself on the years of Orla,
no problem,
he would have been able to do it. So you're not doing anything for me that I can't do. So just like you see from that Braita by Shabbat, that if you're not doing anything that's my prohibited job, then the partnership is 50-50 mutar, right? Here also, because you, the goy, are not doing anything that's asur for me to do for me, then the 50-50 partnership is mutar, right? It was bringing an indirect support for him, not a question. When I said, okay, that's a nice acrobatic thing, but the story has it that Rava was embarrassed at the end. How would he be embarrassed if he brought a support for him? You're saying a whole different conversation between Rava and Ravina. The Gemara says, Lo hayu devarim me'olam. He was never embarrassed. The stories are not aligned. Right? The story is not aligned. It's different. The second version of the story is, this was about Orla. Ravina did have a conversation with Rava. The conversation was to bring a proof for him, and he patted him on the back, and they hugged each other at the end. There was no embarrassment whatsoever, no hurt feelings, right? Says the Gemara, the Gemara says, the story we had before says that he was embarrassed. Says the Gemara, lo hayu devarim me'olam. That part never happened. Says the Gemara, ibailehu stam amai. How about stam? You made the partnership without any agreements whatsoever in the beginning, right? Tashma im hitnu b'tchila mutar. What says that's easy question to answer, because the Braita that Ravina brought to Rava says that if they made a Tanai from the beginning, when they started the partnership, then it's mutar, because then the understanding is I have nothing on Shabbat, you have nothing on Sunday, and we're good to go. Hastama asur. So you see from there that stam would be asur. If stam means they didn't say anything, no agreement, they just started working and hit the ground right away, that would be asur. Mara says that's not a good proof, because look at the seifa, the end of the Braita. The end of the Braita says, Ema seifa im ba'u leheshbon asur. The end of the Braita is that if they came at the very end to do the heshbon, that would be asur, right? Hastama mutar. That means that if they didn't do the heshbon, it's just stam. They hit the ground as equal partners, and they did it 50-50, that would be mutar without talking any details. Elameha leka lemashma mina. The Gemara says, from this Braita you cannot really bring a proof of what would be the din of stam, a regular 50-50% partnership. Now, well, we're out of time, but we're going to discuss, maybe tomorrow, a fascinating story that it happened at the time of Rabbeinu Tam as follows. A Jew was owed money by a goy, and he couldn't cash in his debt. So he said the goy owned a bakery, right? So he said, I'm going to collect the tanur, right, the baking oven. I'm going to collect your business for my debt. Now it's no longer your bakery, it's my bakery, right? Now the bakery has to work every day. So how does that work exactly with having an owner that's Jewish? The bakery is working on Shabbat, and their makeup was that the Ofed, the baker himself, who used to be the owner, still working there, and for his work he's getting some payment. So the way they wanted to do it is, you take the profit of Shabbat as the baker, as the person that's working there, I take the profit of all the other 6 days. That was a case that was brought to Rabbeinu Tam, and to first originally paskin that is mutar. Rabbeinu Tam disagrees with him, right? These are two of the biggest Baalei Tosafot. Ri is Rabbeinu Yitzchak Hazaken, and Rabbeinu Tam is Rabbeinu Yaakov, as a grandson of Rashi. And then he reversed himself, the Ri at the end, agreed with Rabbeinu Tam that case should be asur, and the Jew cannot have that type of partnership with the goy, which is something which Bezat Hashem will discuss, and it has, of course, to do with the partnerships in current day and age. Chazaku Baruch.